Hello. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our panel discussion. This is looking at streamlining permitting. Never the most exciting topic, so hopefully we can make it a bit more lively this afternoon. But it's all about balancing speed, sustainability, and stakeholder rights. So permitting and that permitting timeline for major projects has extended, and it's now looking at around 18 years globally to get a mine through to permitting stage. And this raises critical questions. So is this a sign of accountability or inefficiency? And does this still mean safe, or is it actually just meaning that we are late? Today we have a panellist with groups from government, we've got from industry, and right across, and working to understand how we can accelerate that permitting space without sacrificing environmental integrity. So to join us, I'm just going to run through again. We've got Jennifer Prospero, Senior Director, Sustainability at Eldorado Gold. She's bringing corporate global mining perspective and the ESG insights to the panel. We have the Honourable Caitlin Cleveland, Minister of Education, Culture and Employment, and also the Minister of Industry, Tourism and Investment for Northwest Territories. Christo, she's VP Resources Sector Sales Lead for EMEA at Worley, and Ntokozo Nzimande, Deputy Director General, Mining Minerals and Petroleum Policy Development in South Africa. So, let's dive in. And I'm going to go straight with that first question on permitting delays having grown significantly. So, Minister Cleveland, is it about greater accountability, or are we looking at inefficiencies in the system?
Thank you for the question. And I have to disagree with you right off the bat. It is exciting. It's very exciting. So I would say it's actually neither. And I'm going to speak from the context of the Northwest Territories. And just to give everybody an idea of where I'm joining you from, up along the top 40% of Canada is 3 territories. And they have a definite deficit when it comes to infrastructure. It is 5.5 times the size of the UK, bigger than the entire EU combined, and there's 150,000 people that live there, and a ton of beautiful rock, a ton of opportunity. But we have a very unique operating system. That I would say the biggest issue is a lack of understanding as to how to work within the jurisdiction. And that's where both government comes in, but also industry as well. And so taking the time to understand how to do business on the land of the people whose land you're operating on is incredibly important and really is the key to success there. We have a co-management system where we actually work on drafting our legislation with Indigenous governments of the Northwest Territories. So when you come in and you're working within the system, we expect people to be able to do engagement early and often, work directly with Indigenous governments, form partnerships, and that is your ticket to getting through the system in a realistic amount of time and a quick amount of time. We've had success where people have, come in for water permitting, and the Land and Water Boards have said, this is going to take 2 months, and bang on, it was 2 months. Our average right now is 31 months for our last 4 projects that went through, and their success was tied to understanding the system, working with Indigenous governments, getting in early, and engaging often. So I'd say that from a Northwest Territories perspective, it's all about understanding.
It's interesting actually, because I don't know how many of the audience were actually at Critical Mining conference yesterday. There was Stephen Least, who is the Minister for Energy and Mines in Ontario, and he said that Canada was the second slowest in the OECD. So you've got very different perspectives, one from Northwest Territories and one from a sort of federal perspective.
Yeah, absolutely. Our perspective in the territory would be different than Canada. And the other thing that I would, as a whole, the other thing that I would say that's changing right now across Canada is the investment that you're seeing from the federal government in nation building projects. So with their Bill C5, so their Build Canada Act, they've essentially taken out part of the process, which is deciding if a project should go through or not, and going right, like a fast forward right to the how are we going to get this done. So they've done that through by enacting essentially a major projects office that walks people through kind of a white glove service, if you will, as to how to get through the process. And so they're definitely, from a perspective of Canada as a whole, effort to see projects get done much quicker and with purpose, but focusing on projects that are of national significance to the entire country.
Thank you. Jennifer, from an industry perspective, what strategies have you seen to actually work through the system in an efficient way?
Yeah, thank you for having me, first of all. And I'm going to talk about a few things here that may sound like no-brainers, but hopefully I can give a few examples and interesting tidbits. I'll say first is on the company side, I think now there's an impetus to do environmental and social work upfront in a way that exceeds regulatory requirements. Of course, companies are often only willing to make these large investments, and it is very expensive to do these sort of industry-leading ESHAs if there's permitting certainty, at least around the process. But definitely, I would say that's becoming the norm. It's certainly something that Eldorado did for our Skouries copper gold project in northern Greece. It'll be coming into commercial production next year. And we made a conscious decision to develop an environmental and social impact assessment that far exceeded the regulatory requirements because we were seeking investment from certain investors that had very high standards like EBRD. The other, I would say, is the idea of the sort of one-stop permitting shop. And this is more on the regulatory side. It's obviously very helpful in those contexts where you're dealing with multiple levels of government. And it's not as simple as, saying they'll talk to each other. I think this is a process-driven change that has happened in some jurisdictions and needs to happen in others. And one of the opportunities I see there is also on the harmonization between environmental permitting and technical permitting. In most jurisdictions, this is really linear, and that's part of that timeline piece. But you do need significant amount of technical information to do your environmental impact assessment. And so I think there's lots of opportunities to shorten timelines there. The third thing I'll say is engage stakeholders often and early. I know that probably truly is the biggest no-brainer, but it's one we've heard already several times today around the trust deficit that we have in this industry. A couple of areas, maybe opportunities that we have. One is on the development and the existence of mining standards. One that we have on the horizon is the Consolidated Mining Standard Initiative. I think there's an opportunity there for those standards to help close that trust gap so that they mean something when companies apply them. I worked on a mining project many moons ago that co-designed a monitoring program for whales in the Canadian high Arctic where there wasn't a lot of scientific baseline. And so rather than trying to sort of over-engineer permit requirements for science that wasn't there, the project was able to move forward with this idea of co-designing monitoring programs. And to me, that was something novel and I think could be widely adopted in industry. And last 2 points, and I know we'll talk about this more. One is the use of risk-tiered permitting, and we'll talk a lot about this in terms of the nation-building projects, but also these lower-risk projects, because I think that consistency in approvals is really what the market needs to see to have confidence in industry. And the last thing is digitization. And I know we talk about AI as this large concept, and I don't even pretend to understand what the capabilities are. But certainly I think from a review of permit applications, there's a use for AI that could be very, very helpful for governments, and that needs to be tapped into more.
Brilliant, thank you. And I guess, so we kind of mentioned it early on in terms of the white glove, I presume kind of a concierge to take through, but in going back to you, Keelan, are there any reforms on the horizon in terms of what you're doing with the territories that we should be aware of, and how does that factor through?
Yeah, a few things, and so I'm excited about the kind of the parallel pieces here of what we're working on and what Jennifer is asking for. And so one of them is a one-stop shop because we have multiple levels of government. So we've got Indigenous governments working with territorial government, working with the federal government, and that's one of the key differences between a territory and a province is we're still so interconnected with our federal government as well. So bringing all of the pieces together for industry is going to be critically important to being able to really help people understand. That's where, when I say government has responsibility in that, that definitely is where it sits, and bringing that certainty and also empowering that engagement, which then leads to trust, which then leads to that certainty piece. Another piece that our land and water boards are working on right now is how we actually parallel the environmental assessment piece along with your water and land permitting and your licensing piece in order to shorten some of that time frame yet again. And then the third piece I wanted to highlight that our Mackenzie Valley Land and Water Board did this year was actually templating pieces. So when we talk about digitization and finding ways to kind of work smarter, not harder, if there is an answer that you want industry to give you, just tell them what it is. Don't make them do darts in the dark. Just tell them exactly what it is and ask industry, hey, if there's another way that you want to do this that isn't the standard way that we're expecting you to do things, then go through all the trouble of filling it out. But otherwise, here's what we're actually looking for. And I think that's a huge, easy win for industry.
Okay. And Christo, you kind of work across jurisdictions in many different areas. Is this something that you're seeing?
Look, so thank you for this. I really feel like the thorn between the roses this afternoon. I want to challenge a few things, and I want us to agree that, first of all, the subsoil, what's under the subsoil belongs to the people of the nation. But then I want to cast our minds back. I mean, this topic in terms of environmental approvals, has been discussed to death at conference after conference after conference. And, your introduction said it. It still takes 15 or 17 years. So it seems like we're having these conversations, but we're not really making any progress in terms of shortening the approval process. And I want to cast everybody's mind back to 2020. And I know it's not 100% that you can draw a correlation between the two. But when COVID hit the world, suddenly all governments, all industry, pharmaceuticals got together and developed, vaccines in record time. Trial vaccines, within 3 months. Injecting people, stop the blood, deaths, whatever, and I'm not an advocate or not against the vaccines. But what I'm saying is, we all recognized and we believed across the globe, this is a problem. And we collectively decided to address the problem. Now, we keep on talking about, critical minerals and how we develop critical minerals, but the issue is still, fundamentally for me, do we believe that this is really an issue? And have we really attempted something to address it? And for me, the question is in also to the governments, what are we doing to really add value to the people of the country in terms of what's sitting in subsoil? And I want to use an example of a country that we're doing work for. And this country has gone, it's probably not one of the wealthiest countries in the world, like Canada, Australia, or, but they've actually established, and probably similar to South Africa, a fund for reconstruction and development. And what they've done is they said, we understand that there's an urgency here, there's a need. We need to get projects up and running a lot quicker than what has been happening in the past. So they actually actively have decided to invest in projects. So they've engaged us to, and it can be any company for that matter, they've engaged, a company, us in this instance, to help them, through the drilling, through the permitting, through the approvals, because they know what's required from an approvals process. We've managed to actually shrink the approval process. But what they've done in the process as well is they've added value to the people of the country. So instead of just issuing a tenement and go, well, you can go and drill there and get this here, and 16 years later you can come and we'll give you a mine license, for your mine. They've actually gone and said, well, we're going to take control of this because it's owned by our people, and we are going to develop it with industry to a certain stage where we can go to industry and say, well, here's a project. It is feasible. We've done a scoping study. We've done a pre-feasibility study. There is a flow sheet. And instead of getting, $2 for the project, they may get $50 for the project. because they've added value along the way. And for me, that is probably the thing that I see is kind of lacking. You know, we introduce a lot of regulations and policies, and yes, AI can help a lot, but fundamentally, you know, my challenge to governments are, what are all the governments doing? We believed in COVID, we got a vaccine, we work together. What are we doing in terms of approvals and especially in terms of critical minerals?
I think there will be a lot of comments about the speed on which we put vaccines forward during COVID, and perhaps we are looking for accountability in a different way. But yeah, okay, it's some interesting ideas there, thank you. And I guess looking at it from a South African perspective, you're looking at the policy in terms of, are you seeing delays between the regional and the national government, and how is that being addressed in the South African context?
Well, let me start by saying currently in South Africa, we are seized with several reforms across different sectors, mining being one of them. We are currently reviewing our mining legislation. And one of the biggest challenges, I guess, or issues that has been raised with us by investors is the point Christo raises in terms of how do you ensure that projects are licensed within the shortest time possible. But somebody again this morning on a panel made a comment, I think it's one of the ministers in the morning, made a comment about in his area at some point, someone would need about 24 permits to remove a tree, something like that. And this is something we're looking at in South Africa as well, where we're saying for one to operate a mine, you need your mining license, you need a water use license, you need an approved EIA, and many others. But in the main, these three, and they are processed and issued by different authorities. So we've come together and said, how do we harmonize the three pieces of legislation to ensure that we process these licenses in parallel at the shortest time possible? And I will say this, leading the pack currently in South Africa is water and sanitation. It used to take them up to 3-4 years to issue a water use license. Now they do it in 90 days. Wow. And they called us into a room with the environmental department and said, these are our timelines, how do you then align? And we spent time with them, looking at our own processes to say, where can we shorten our timelines? Of course, without compromising on the side of consultations with interested and affected parties, because I find, both in mining and oil and gas projects for that matter, that a lot of time goes into that as well, because communities and the public in general are becoming more and more aware of, as Christo puts it, what's underneath the subsurface is theirs, right? They're becoming more and more of their right to a fair share. They're becoming more and more of their environmental rights. And so a lot of time, as well as social benefits for them. And so a lot of time also goes into consultation with them in that regard. But as we run with the reforms, we're making sure that we're pulling our timelines together with other licensing authorities as well.
Thank you. So we've mentioned a few things in that whole concept. We mentioned the concierge, we mentioned a couple of others, but actually I was thinking, Jennifer, you started talking about maybe there should be a premium permitting lane. Is there something that we should be looking at in that regard for ESG positive companies?
Yeah, I'll say I think it's a very interesting concept. I don't think it's a silver bullet for all of the issues that we're talking about here, but some of the potential benefits for a premium permitting lane would be that it does incentivize, I think, that strong ESG leadership, if that's the criteria for ending up in that lane. Potentially reduces delays for projects that have real benefits to landowners and rights holders, and very clearly could align well with these different public policy agendas that we're seeing coming out now around critical minerals. I mean, we can say all we want, that we want to improve critical mineral supply chain, that we want to have stronger national ties to the industry. But if we don't actually put in place those opportunities, then they won't be realized. I'll say some of the risks I see with a premium permitting lane would be one, that ESG leadership doesn't just mean major mining companies, the ones with the most resources to dedicate to it. So I think it puts some impetus on the regulators to really understand the industry and really understand who those players are. I'll also say to have public trust for a program like this, it is upon the governments to really stand behind those fast track decisions and explain transparently why they're made. It shouldn't be on industry to defend why they were selected. I think that creates an interesting conflict. And then not necessarily a risk, but of course we can't have projects advancing that don't have or haven't honored Indigenous rights and human rights. And so that does take time. And so squaring that circle will be important. I'll give one very quick example of where I think this could work well. We have a mine in Quebec in the Abitibi region. It's called Lamac. The mine is actually operating within Val-d'Or, within urban boundaries. We enjoy very, very high public support. We work in great partnership with First Nations in the region. And we have a fully permitted project that's in operation now. We've discovered another deposit within the footprint that will increase our operations, but also requires us to expand our tailings capacity and build a new facility. So there's an expansion permit regime that has to happen there. To me, that's kind of one of these no-brainer, low-risk projects. And I mentioned earlier that I think there's an opportunity for these projects to help support a narrative around permitting change and changing this environment. Because if we just focus on those nation building projects, investors are just looking for that next, who's going to be that next big winner in this lottery that we've created. I think having these sort of lower risk projects with good ESG credentials that are sort of moving fastly and swiftly through the permitting process will help support that narrative and build that investment climate that we desperately need in the mining industry.
Well, thank you. You made that up really nicely. From a government perspective, and I don't mind which way we go first, is it feasible? Does it work from your side?
So we, in a sense, are kind of already doing it because within our system, we drafted the legislation with Indigenous governments, so the buy-in is already there. We've done this work together. It means that for a mine to get to production, they have to have a socioeconomic agreement that speaks to things like local employment. They have to have a benefit agreement that speaks to what Indigenous governments are getting at the end of the day, because we're not doing mining anymore like we did 100 years ago. We're not doing mining where all the benefits leave the land on where they're coming from. And so if somebody got the ESGs, they're going through the process, they're doing the engagement, they're involving the people that need to be at the table, they are those ESG companies that we want operating in the territory. They are getting fast-tracked in the sense that they're making it through the system. Anybody who's not doing that is not making it through the system.
I think the approach is the same. One of the things we say quite a lot is, you hear people talking about inclusion, and we're saying we're moving from inclusion to centering, to people centering, right? And how the actual permitting is done, it's actually focused on moving away from paper-based licensing systems to more parallel digital workflows. And currently, as the department in South Africa, we are implementing a new cadastral system, which will ensure that processes move faster. But also, whilst you are focusing more on the technical evaluation of the application for a license, parallel processes in terms of ESG, value, fair share for the stakeholders, traditional leaders, and the communities, host communities where the mining is actually happening, continues. And with the whole view of literally shortening the overall timeline that it takes to issue a permit.
I can
Look, I'm not really clear. What's the criteria for a fast lane or premium service? You know, when you fly an airline premium service, it means you've flown a lot, spend a lot of money, which you can link to larger companies like Eldorado. I mean, for me, a premium lane makes sense if you have a criteria that's, it's to do with the critical minerals, maybe complex projects like rare earths. I think a premium lane for me makes a lot more sense, because you want to get a dedicated, and they're trying this in the EU, you want to get a dedicated person, allocated by the government to work with you as a premium customer in the development and getting approvals that are highly complex going forward. To save to Rio Tinto or some of the big companies, well, because you've done it 100 times, it's easy, you can just go into the premium lane. For me, it doesn't solve the problem, because a lot of these large companies now use the smaller companies to do the scoping studies and the drilling and the permitting for them, and they walk in at the end, give a lot of money. The smaller shareholders are really happy because they're making a lot of money, and the big companies are buying a great project. Nothing against that, but in that whole chain, for me the question is, what's the criteria for that premium lane? Is that really helping the progress of the country, or the minerals that we need, especially in energy transition? If you look at the deficit, copper, lithium that they forecast, 2030 onwards, and then especially in terms of rare earths, where China's the dominant force, I think you should have a premium lane that really look at complex projects, difficult jurisdictions, and how you can help those prospective, developers get their project and their permits quicker than, the normal, small guy who's standing in a queue, and you'll get to it in 17 years from now. Because those are the minerals we need.
So that's an interesting point, and actually it's leading on from that. So is there a way that governments should be working together to make sure that there is a coordinated approach to these specific minerals that we're particularly concerned about, in light of what we're saying about the dominance of China in this space?
Yes. I absolutely think that there needs to be coordination, and from a Canadian perspective, the federal government in Canada just released their budget this fall in November, and there's substantial dollars in that budget for infrastructure builds, in like $1 billion just for Arctic infrastructure. There's another $6 billion for like building retrofits and community infrastructure. There's another $3 billion specific to critical minerals. And then $67 million for like regulatory improvements, which in my perspective is funding for Indigenous governments to be at the table. That's where those dollars need to go. But that coordination piece needs to happen, because when I'm sitting down and talking to Indigenous governments about what they want to see, and they're talking to industry as well about wanting to be involved in a different way in this day and age in mining. So it's Indigenous governments in Canada are eligible for grants instead of loans. Industry is only eligible for loans. That totally changes the dynamic of that funding, and also the dynamic of that relationship, especially when Indigenous governments want equity ownership. They want to show up to the table and say, you know what, we're going to fund the energy piece, and we're going to be your equal partner in this project. And all of a sudden, it's a much different relationship. It's much different potential and opportunity that all of a sudden opens different doors that I think needs to be coordinated, and also needs to be reflected in how we're doing business today. But in the same sense, when you all of a sudden are having that tight-knit relationship, you are working your way through the permitting process in a much quicker way, because all of a sudden, the people who are also doing the permitting are on your team.
Okay. I'm smiling because I just heard the numbers that you're talking about, that you're investing in mine. We had our critical minerals strategy come out in the UK at the weekend, and they are not those numbers.
Well, we still really want to attract your investment over in Canada, so.
but sorry, I just want to go back to this whole conversation that we're having around, fast lane, premium lanes. I mean, and I told you I did some AI research on ChatGPT, but if you go to ChatGPT and you see, how you can make approvals quicker, it kind of relates to this fast lane concept, where a lot of the generic stuff you can actually get AI to do for you. So the companies with the easy process, you know, if there's good collaboration between industry and service providers and government, you can actually get these AI approvals or AI to help you a lot quicker in terms of your approvals. I mean, they can do the data monitoring, they can help with digital twins, they can even you know, give you the temperature of the community in terms of you know, your approval permit that you're asking for. So I'm not saying it's a bad thing, but I'm saying, you know, it's probably, you know, using AI as well in terms of that for the easy ones, so you can get the human resource that you need for the complex ones, to really attend to the complex ones and get them out of, you know, the rat race. I mean, one of the big things that, you know, came back from the research is, you know, the back and forth between the applicant and government in terms of missing documents, repeating documents, government changes. That is a loop that seems to be never ending until you get your approval.
So we're really talking about the idea of bringing in digital workers to really streamline.
Yeah.
In fact, I think this is what I spoke to earlier on with us introducing a digital licensing system, because then it takes away that human error element. But also something very interesting, there are stakeholders raised with us as we were consulting on the legislative review. They were talking to us about introducing something like a stop the clock rule, where once an application is in the system and all the requirements have been complied with, the clock starts ticking, and there must be a clearly defined timeline in the law that ties the regulator to making a decision, because there are time lags from time to time in the licensing process.
So we mentioned a few circumstances that actually you turned it really nicely of making people the centre of the decision making. But if I'm just conscious of time, we've got about a few minutes left to go. So if you were going to change one part of the permitting process tomorrow, what would that one thing be, and why, in order to unlock this system? I'm going to start with you, Jen.
So every permit that I personally put forward should be approved. No, I'm just kidding. I think probably along the lines of what we're just talking about now, we can't put any more permit applications on the desk of regulators. They're overwhelmed now, or at least the ones that we're dealing with all over the world. And so I think if we could change one thing, it would be to compel the regulators to think differently about how they're sourcing technical expertise for permitting, and looking more at third-party support. So potentially looking at like an accredited reviewer model similar to what we have for independent engineers and tailings, or something along those lines, because we very quickly need to relieve that as a bottleneck. And I think all the other improvements that we're suggesting now aren't possible if we don't start relieving the pressure there.
In the same vein, and I mean, I've mentioned it already today, for us in the Northwest Territories, it's making sure that Indigenous governments are properly resourced in order to be able to field the sheer volume of outreach that's coming in. We live in a very critically rich area. There is focus on the Arctic like there has never been before in my lifetime in Canada. And so an Indigenous government that has 3 people working in their environmental area is getting 42 outreaches from companies. And understanding, you know, who to take seriously and who to not is very, very challenging. And that also creates delays, right? And so making sure that Indigenous governments are properly resourced is incredibly important.
Well, seeing that I'm surrounded by government, I might as well go for the government here. Look, can I just, I'm not against the permitting, you know, and all of that, but it's a very general comment here, and it's probably because this is a constant thing in Australia. But it seems like every year governments seem to introduce new laws. Every year there's a new law without repealing the previous law. There are more laws, and the more laws gets introduced by government, the more bureaucratic it gets. The more people you need to employ to work through the laws. I mean, you know, is it getting to a point where you go, well, we're not going to introduce another law for approvals of a mine? I mean, I want to take big rocks and make small rocks. That's the purpose of what I want to do. But I don't want to take 17 years or work with my client for 17 years to get there. So, you know, is there an intent from government to stick to and go, this is our approval, we're not going to change it, you know, we can repeal old laws, because that is part of the bottleneck. It's a constant change of laws and regulations.
You're looking at me like you want me to answer. I've got an answer for that. We both live in countries, if we're talking about Australia and Canada, they're both countries who took advantage of the countries that they're trying to take big rocks and turn into little rocks for a very long time. And so there's reparations that need to happen, and a lot of the laws you're seeing are part of that.
Just like feels like it's never ending, eh?
Sorry, Christo, but I'm not sure I can agree with that, because we live in a changing and ever-changing world, right? And it calls for us to change and move with the time. Obviously, not change the laws every year, all the time. Give stability, give investors, you know, that sense of security of tenure. Whilst you're keeping up with the times, there are now new environmental requirements. You've got to keep up with that. There's social aspects that you have to take into account. You've got to keep up with that. But if I were to change one thing really, and from my own experience in the policy space in South Africa, it would be integrate and simplify the licensing process.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, South Africa's got a stable government. The current government's been in power for many years. But if you look at Australia, we probably change governments every 3 years. So every 3 years, there's a new law, there's a new government, there's a new Minister for Environment, there's new advisors. It's just, I think that's add a lot of unnecessary bureaucratic red tape to the approval process.
Okay. Thank you. We have got a few minutes left, so I'm going to open the floor. And yeah, if you could keep it concise, because
Tanya was going to ask a difficult question.
First, and if you can ask a question, and obviously just quickly mention the name of your company as well.
You hear me?
Yeah.
Hi, my name's Louise Portis. I'm the Environment and Social Manager with Thor Explorations Limited. We've got an operating mine in Nigeria and exploration licenses in Senegal and Côte d'Ivoire. And I'm also a town planner by background, so I'm used to the government legislation. But it's also good for me to see how other places operate. We've just recently got provisional approval in Senegal as of 2 weeks ago for a mine project there. But in Nigeria, we've been operating a mine for 5 years, and we're the first legal commercial gold mine in Nigeria. And I keep saying the word legal. I think you understand what I mean by that. But there was a couple of good things in Nigeria that I thought was good because they learnt from the oil and gas sector. And one of them was about, we're talking about permitting here, but once we got an EIA, we had to get a community development agreement with the communities in which we were working. And I actually thought that was a really good idea because it brought in what I call the cultural governance aspects into that permitting process. It took about 18 months to get it, but we got the social, it was the inputs of the agreement, outputs of the contract, the outcome of trust. And I think that's something that we can all learn about, getting that other license before you start a construction. And I'm not sure what your view is, because it was endorsed by government but led between us and the communities. I thought that was quite good. And just having been through the permitting, EIA permitting process in Senegal, one thing that did save us a lot of time was that they had gone out and done consultation with the communities in the mining jurisdictions, where beside Endeavour in Senegal, and they had agreements about what the communities would want with regard to socioeconomic and community development aspects. And that really saved us a lot of time with regard to understanding. We will still go in and do an agreement with them, but it was actually really good to hear up front what their issues were. Both of them are a bit community-based, because that is another licence, but I'm just wondering what you think of that, because I think it's been a really good innovation and it's been good to see it in different countries and how it works.
don't know whether that's to anyone in particular.
I can take that. I think thanks, Louise, for sharing those experiences. So in South Africa, we've built into the law what we call a social and labor plan, which is one of the requirements for a company to undertake, go and consult your host communities, agree with them what their benefit is going to be before we issue that mining license, right? But more and more, as we engage communities that host mines, there's even broader awareness where they're saying, where do we strengthen? You know, how do we do it better and how do we do it faster? But also additionally, on the point you raise about a government-led broader consultation, one of our pieces of legislation in South Africa, the Promotion of Administrative Justice Act, makes provision for government in cases where it considers a project to have a potential impact on communities to drive a process like that. And we've done it in oil and gas, where we went with Minister in 2023 across 7 kingdoms of the Eastern Cape province, consulting for potential impact of oil and gas projects. 7 kingdoms across a province, government-led, and the impact of that is massive.
Brilliant. I think we're out of time. So I just want to say a big thank you to the panelists. I think what we're hearing is that it's not, speed is obviously something that still bothers Christo.
Always.
But it's also about trust and transparency, and definitely about collaboration and putting people at the heart of it. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. We have a huge round of applause for an absolutely fantastic and engaging panel. Thank you very much.